were to ask you to pick out some nations in Europe who have been influential players over the past 300 or so years, you have a lot of choices. Most people are probably going to go with, the United Kingdom, a dominant naval and economic force that conquered the world. The sun never set on the British Empire for a large amount of time, and their victories in both world wars and surrounding events and wars and conflicts has led them to become a dominant force in Europe over that time span to the day, where they still are an incredibly powerful nation both militarily and economically, although that power seems to wane. Perhaps you go a little south to France, their sister nation, who, under Napoleon, conquered the continent and spent fear throughout the entirety of Europe, that so much so that every other nation had to join hands to try to prevent him from taking over the world. Also, they have several stints of having high economic and military prowess, also having a massive empire that spanned across the globe. Perhaps you go to the newcomer in the era of Germany, who, rising through Prussia and becoming the North German Federation, put the world to its knees for 6 years in the 1930s and 40s. Absolutely had the world against them with their combined allies of Italy and Japan. Perhaps you go with the old dog to the east, the big bear of Russia, who has been a thorn in the side of nations both in the eastern and western hemisphere for the longest time. A massive, sprawling nation with many ethnic groups and a military might that consists to this day, consistently seen as one of the most powerful nations in the world at this point in time, possibly behind only China and the United States. And I can look at other nations in Europe and you'll be like, that makes sense why they're not interested. Like, the Balkan nations spent most of their time controlled by somebody else, whether that be the Austria-Hungarian Empire, Italy, Turkey. They really didn't have a sense of becoming a relevant nation during that time period. The Benelux would make a good interest, as both Belgium and the Netherlands had their own massive colonial empires. But when you think of movers and shakers of those 300 years, these mostly don't come up. The Baltic nations kind of kept to themselves, and while they did have some colonies spread throughout, they were mostly either dealing with themselves or under the control of other nations, such as the Russians owning Finland, and all the way up to Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania at different points. Maybe you'll look at Italy, but Italy has a smaller colonial empire. However, their relevance really did not manifest because the nation was split. Because, they couldn't unify themselves until way too late in that time period and never really dominated the globe or any other powers in that same way. Austria, Hungary, and any of those other nations seemed to fall away as well, as they had really small blips of radiance, but never really brought the world to its knees. And then you go to the last part of Europe I have not named, the Iberian Peninsula, with Portugal, another globe-trotting nation who never had quite the military might, but its economic connections and its smart alliances with the United Kingdom made it relevant. However, nothing nearly the first four nations I described. And then you have the final one, the subject we're going to talk about today, the first massive colonial empire in Europe, Española, Spain. Spain, a little different than all those other nations. Spain was really the first of the massive colonial empires, and they did it very differently than all the others. While most of the other empires moved their people in and just kind of, moved out the natives and kind of supplanted them, the Spaniards did it different. So much so that the Spaniards created their own ethnic group of people, which controls 60% plus of the New World to this day. The Spaniards came first, they came a lot, and created a whole new race of people and exported the gold back to Spain. Spain is a very interesting nation that was incredibly powerful during its beginning stages of the exploration era and into the 1800s. However, like all good things, things must fall. And what happened to Spain would lead to what happened to France and the UK and their own colonial empires. What happened to Spain first, it happened hard, with Spain not having a single control of any of those territories to this day, getting beaten up by those same colonies or friends of those colonies, a la the United States freeing Cuba from them in the Spanish-American War. But why Spain today, you ask? Because Spain is an interesting nation outside of the global history. I really want to focus on what's going on today in Spain, with, a certain socialist uprising in the government, breakaway separatist parties being empowered and given liberties and rights and freedom from persecution that they otherwise probably would not have, and a dangerous stage is being set up in the modern era for a potential fifth Spanish Civil War. And I find that to be a very interesting conundrum for Europe, NATO, and the world at large to possibly have to reconcile with, depending on how the cards fall. Spain had an interesting kind of time period where, they had a few civil wars. And most people know the big one, right? The final civil war that kind of led into the Second World War, in which the Carlists consolidated with the Francoists to join a national party against the established ruling Republican government of Spain, which was a coalition of democratic and socialist forces that were controlling Spain. That's kind of the civil war everybody knows. Obviously, if you understand a little more about Spanish history, there were three Carlist civil wars in the decades in the 1800s before the Spanish Civil War in 1936. So Spain's not a stranger to civil wars and revolution. It's just, the nation right beside them is kind of famous for every 70 years killing the king or the prime minister or president and putting in somebody else in charge. It's kind of what this Frenchmen are famous for. So Spain also did those things, but the government kind of survived more often than those. They usually beat those civil wars rather than losing. However, in 36, the Francoists or the Nationalists or the Fascists or the Phalangists or whatever you want to call them, they won and consolidated in power, and that government would last until the 70s, until after Franco's death, and it kind of collapsed down and went to a monarchist government who decided to become a democratic, and that's how you get the modern constitutional monarchy that Spain is consolidated with today. And why that's relevant today is because we have a certain similar situation rising up in Spain that kind of, was prevalent in the leading up part. Because back during that time, as I said, it was the nationalist versus a socialist aligned government. And who should know, the ruling government in Spain today is a socialist government working with certain separatist groups in Catalonia. Obviously it used to be known as the County of Barcelona, the seat of the old nation of Aragon before they were consolidated into Spain. Why that is relevant is because if you were to, say, draw a map of the Spanish Civil War everybody knows, the nationalists and the socialists fought along lines. And where was one of the seats of power of the socialists during the Spanish Civil War? It was in Barcelona, or Catalonia as it is known. How this plays out today is that the Prime Minister of Spain has recently decided to form a coalition with the separatists, the political party, because they did not have enough votes to have a coalition in the government. The nationalists actually had enough to prevent that, but the Prime Minister decided that he wanted to control the Spain and have the unified power, decided, hey, what if I work with the militant separatists who want to split this country up and have everything become independent? He was like, yeah, sure, let's do that. So now you have an interesting situation in Spain where you're having protests, if not somewhat rioting, going on in northern Spain of nationalist forces, they're really more protesters, being like, we do not want the socialists to break Spain into pieces, as the Catalonians and many others want to do. So you have this interesting dynamic where you have a socialist force in the east, working with a democratic government. Meanwhile, you have nationalists protesting against this. And where are the nationalists located? In the north of Spain. So if I were to put up, say, a map of Spain during the Spanish Civil War, you'll see battle lines look a little similar, don't you think? And, Spain is a very tenuous position because of out of its historical precedence and where it's at now. Because a lot's going on in Europe, and I'm not sure if Europe can handle another civil war or war on the continent. Spain is interesting because, the nation has a lot of rich history. Obviously, they were the nation who bulwarked against the Muslim invasion in the Reconquista to battle back the Moors and retake the continent for Christendom. And that was a fantastic feat by the Spaniards back then. It's truly amazing that they were at least able to hold on for so long and eventually Reconquista and bring everything back with the help of the French. But looking at it now, a lot of that Muslim influence is still there. I mean, you go in the south where Granada, the last caliphate, was. There's still a lot of Muslim influence, and that's still going on today as migrants continue to move over or pour or invade, however you prefer to put it, into Europe. That still happens in Spain. That's always been the case. Spain has been the gateway between North African Arabs and European Christians. And that relationship has never ended, and it continues to this day. And depending on your view of immigration, the situation is not going so hot for Spaniards these days. So Spain's got their own internal conflicts going on. with a rise in Muslims, the decrease in Catholicism, and a separatist force rising in the east, Spain's situation is very strenuous. Like it's not great, and also having a influence political schism between the two top popular sides is not great. Although the socialists are not doing their part in not inflaming this because they're digging up the corpses of Spanish war saints and trying to remove any Christian iconography they can because the socialists are atheistic in their policies and their view, and it's kind of creating this weird cycle of the more the atheists try to get rid of Christianity, they may decrease the numbers of Christians, but they're making more fervent members in the north of the Catholic Spaniards. So while sure maybe they decrease the overall numbers, the Christians that exist are becoming more inflamed against them, leading to this fueling of the nationalist sympathies against the socialist sympathies. It's this weird dichotomy that the Catalans are kind of fueling and the socialists are kind of fueling, where they're they're inflaming this opposite side, and that side is getting more and more fervent as the day goes by. The socialists and the Catalans are not doing anything to dissuade them at all. The government is making no attempt to appease the other side. It's like this completely antagonistic relationship between the nationalist and the socialist parts of the government, and I think that's going to possibly end in very, very bad circumstances for everybody on the continent. Just some background before we get to the greater implications. Catalonia, as Barcelona, is a weird place in Spain, like most places in Spain, because of its influences. Obviously, you have the south, which is very Muslim influenced. You have the north in Navarra, which is influenced by their isolationism, being one of the last places to stand against the Moors. You got Barcelona. Barcelona, or Catalonia, or as it was known as Aragon, is a very interesting place because it's got a lot of influences. It's got a lot of Spanish influence, obviously, a lot of French influence, and a lot of Italian influence, which I think a lot of fuels a lot of the Catalonians' desire for independence. They're just very unique people compared to the rest of Spain, where sure they have their Spanish influence, but they have so many other influences and culture that they're kind of their own distinct people. They're not really any of the nations around them. They're kind of their own separate people. So I understand why they want their independence, but I think that's going to lead to much bigger issues. And this independence fuel is being flamed by the fact that over the current prime minister's rule in beforehand, corruption has become rampant along the decentralized Spanish control. So each of the regions in Spain are, doing their own self-interest and not for the interest of Spain. And so because the centralization is weak and corruption is high, all these places are basically independent of each other. All these regions of Spain run on their own times and do things for their own self-interest, not for that of Spain. So now you've got this situation, basically like America prior to their Civil War, or our Civil War, I should say, where America was there was a bunch of states with a weaker central government, and after the Civil War kind of flipped, where the central government is the key. It is America, and you are a part of it, rather than we make up America. America is because of us, not the other way around. Spain is in the situation where the regions control Spain, not the central government it appeals. And that's probably due to the fact of the socialists weakening the centralized government and empowering the regions, or at least allowing the corruption to come to a point where the regions kind of have a weird, powerful relationship with the Spanish government. How this becomes a more broad and vengeful issue for the rest of Europe is that Spain and the civil wars have not been great for Europe as of late. The Spanish Civil War was kind of the powder keg that would eventually blow up in the face of Europe and eventually spark off the Second World War. Europe at the moment is very, very divided and kind of fractured over situations going on, right? There's a war on the continent with the Ukrainian-Russian war going on. There's a civil war breaking out. Not a civil war. I guess there are different nations between Israel and Palestine, which is kind of already divided the inhabitants of these nations, where sides do not know which side is the morally correct one to support. And I think a true civil war on the western half of the continent would be disastrous, because now you're inflaming tensions even more. And now you're set in a situation of which side does NATO support. You would think NATO would support, the Democratic or the socialist side, because they are probably going to be the Democratic government. But you never know that. And say that's how it breaks down. Does Russia and China, start supporting the nationalists? Is this going to be sort of like a reversal of the original war? Or I guess a continuation of it, perhaps, where the Democratic side has got all the support of Europe, and suddenly these outside players like Russia and China influence the nationalist side. So now, do the Democrats win early? But if the nationalists can hold on, are they going to be able to overwhelm them? Are they going to be able to win people to their side? Like, A Spanish Civil War could certainly divide the Europeans in a very weird spot where some of the nations may not be able to decide on which side they want to support. It could be a very hairy situation where, I'm not saying there's going to be another world war, but certainly that if these sides are not consolidated and brought together on the same side, you could certainly see heightened economic stability related hits to the nations fork out. Like if Spain was to collapse and go into a full-fledged civil war between massive parts of the country, like what do you do if you're the United Kingdom or if you're France? Like do you take a side? Do you not intervene? How is Spain's collapse going to impact the economic situation of the rest of the nations in Europe and the world? Like that's another economy. While Spain may not be the economic powerhouse that the United Kingdom or Germany are, and they may not be a massive military force like France is, they are still an important nation on the global stage and on the European stage. So if they were to, you know, inflame a civil war, what does that do for the rest of Europe? Does that spark up interest in other nations like France, who's just had their own protests going on for years now? Does that possibly spark up some sentiments in Germany? What happens if the nationalists start winning a civil war, right? Does that suddenly inflame other nationalist groups in other nations and be like, hey, if the Spaniards can do it, we can do it? Like, I think Spain is going to be a very interesting tipping block for what happens in the rest of Europe and possibly the world, depending on how things go. Like America would never do it. The right wing party in the United States is too passive to do this, but I certainly could possibly see a very small sliver of Americans being like, why don't we do this? Why are we letting people who actively hate us or want to break this country apart rule us when we can take the power by ourselves? Like certainly that could happen. Is it likely to happen in this country? No, because Americans are too comfy. And that's why I wouldn't expect it to happen in Spain, but it could. I wouldn't expect it to happen to any other nation in Europe, but it could, because people are comfortable. It takes an extreme comfort for that to happen. And maybe we're starting to see the right parameters. Heightened rates of immigration, economic downturn, political unrest, like all of those things are catalysts to stop making people comfortable. And once enough people in the country are not comfortable, now it's everybody's problem. Because conflict starts out, and possibly wars brew. And I think Spain would be interesting demonstrating ground for how that's going to work in the modern era. If Spain does go into a full civil war between the nationalist and socialist parties, it's going to be very interesting to see how those wars coalesce, how the sides line up, how everything's going to break down. Like you would expect the Democratic or Socialist side, whichever you want to call them, to succeed, but that's not a foregone conclusion. It's possible that the Nationalists either outright win or get enough support from right-wing entitled parties to drive them above. Like you never know what's going to happen. And I am very interested to see how this all plays out because Spain is an interesting nation. They got a long history of survival, of resilience, of expansion, of growth, of doing everything they want and can to become a powerful nation. It always hasn't worked out for them. Their empire fell. They were able to expand out first, and they were able to get blown away first. Their control and attempts to create a new race of people rather than subjugating them and exterminating them led to them having a weaker empire on terms of control. Like they did not supplant the natives; they simply breeded with them to create a new race of people, and that race of people had their own identity that was not tied to Spain, and they wanted their independence. Spain was one of the first nations to try out fascism, and the last one to stand, as Italy and Germany tried to expand and conquer. Franco was content to keep his nation alive. All he wanted was best for Spain, and that implied not dying at the hands of the Allies, even if it meant to economic, um, isolation in the first decade afterwards. He got his get back when the Cold War started. It's interesting that Spain has tried so much to survive, to grow, to do everything it can, while, doing its own thing, and now it's at a tipping point where it could be the first real civil war on the continent in forever. Like a real major player in Europe having a conflict that could possibly spill over and lead to other revolutions if things go right. Or if they go wrong, you never know. I think this is going to be a very interesting year and few months where if the things in Spain continue to degrade, you're going to see conflict. Whether that sprawls out into an official war where fronts being established and men going into battles, I don't know. But Spain is interesting. What's going on is interesting. The secessionist movements, the political situation, everything is an interesting situation, and I can't wait to see how it all plays out. And I hope for everyone involved that there's a peaceful solution and that there's no Spaniards that need to go to blows. That the people can get what they need, that Spain returns to the proud nation it was, that they reconquista without bloodshed. But if a reconquista is needed, then the Spaniards need to conduct it in the best way they know how. For God, for glory, and for gold.